Good morning. Welcome, Texas Realtors, to day 2 of our TREPAC Government Affairs Orientation. We have a full schedule for you to discuss the behind-the-scenes aspects of advocacy, including election analysis and media engagement. To kick off our day, let me introduce Jeff Blaylock, who will provide an election analysis.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Realtors. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Jeff Blaylock. I'm the publisher of Texas Election Source, an online subscriber-supported news service that analyzes Texas elections and the political scene in the state. And I'd like to begin this preview of the 2020 election by asking a rather provocative question, and that is, can Donald Trump...
Jeff, if you don't mind, let me tell him a little bit about you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, please go right ahead.
All right. I want to tell them a little bit about you before you get started, if you don't mind.
Certainly, I'll back up.
Jeff is a political junkie and longtime public policy wonk who has worked political campaigns in Texas and several other states, ranging from school boards to legislators to governors to referenda. Offering 25 years of political campaign, government, and advocacy experience, Jeff is a noted expert on Texas politics, legislative process, and public affairs. He has developed a keen sense of elections and voting trends, particularly in Texas. He has built predictive analysis tools to anticipate election results, and he accurately predicted the seismic shift in Texas House seats in 2010 down to a single race. Since then, Jeff has correctly picked more than 98% of Texas races for the legislature, statewide, for statewide office and Congress. Jeff has conducted the most comprehensive analysis of straight party voting in Texas, observing the shifts in voting behavior at the state, county, district, and precinct levels. Using data as far back as 1986, Jeff has tracked voters' increased use of the straight party option and its impact on the election results and partisan competitiveness at all levels of government. For years, Jeff shared his keen insights into Texas politics solely with his consulting clients. Today, Jeff is a freelance public affairs consultant and publisher of Texas Elections Source. Thank you so much for being here, Jeff. And I appreciate you letting me give you the proper introduction that you're due.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. I apologize for jumping the gun on you there. I'm just excited to talk about all these numbers and races. As I said, we're opening with the provocative question of, can Donald Trump turn Texas blue? And I say this on a morning where just about an hour ago, the nationally recognized Cook Political Report has shifted the state to toss up from the lean Republican category. We've had it there for about a week now, and if you've been following 538's moving polling averages over the past few weeks, you'll note that Texas is now considered to be the closest race in the country in terms of the state. These are all words we would never have thought we would be hearing about 4 years ago, maybe even 2 years ago. We've got to start, though, by looking at what happened a little bit in 2018, because 2018 was itself a very unusual election. As you can see, in recent years, turnout in a gubernatorial election, which follows the presidential elections in the other years, goes down considerably as a lot of voters stay home and let a smaller pocket of voters determine the races in those off years. In 2018, that decline was only about 7%. So very much a mold-breaking type of election. It was the smallest decline in the vote total from the preceding presidential election in more than a century. What we are seeing this year is a continuation of that same theme. There are record-shattering vote totals all across the state. A number of counties have already exceeded their 2016 vote total, including Election Day. And that is fueling a lot of discussion about who these folks are who are coming in. In 2020, 2020, we are sitting at about 1.1 to 1.2 million voters who have not previously cast a vote in Texas, at least not in the last 4 election cycles. So that would be going back to 2012. This is on top of the 1.1 million new voters who cast ballots in 2018. So when you take those two numbers together, since President Trump's election in 2016, that's 2.25 million voters who didn't cast ballots in 2016 or prior to that, and that number is still growing as we go through the final 3 days of early voting. The chart there for 2020 shows the preliminary unofficial count of voters through yesterday. I know that number will push up by a couple of tenths of a million because counties like Travis County have not yet reported their daily in-person total from yesterday. But that 8.1 million voters casting ballots so far is easily the highest in state history for early voting. It is 48% of registered voters and is already equal to 91% of the total votes cast in 2016. And even on top of all of that, there's still about 4.6 million recent voters who have not yet participated. All of this is suggesting very, very high turnout, record-shattering turnout here within the state. There's also been an important shift in voter registration. Since 2016, there have been, actually since about 2008 rather, there have been about 2 to 2.25 million people in Texas who are eligible to vote but have not registered to vote. That number has dropped below 2 million this year for the first time in 12 years. And since 2016, the voting eligible population has grown by 1.35 million, while voter registrations have grown by 1.85 million. This reverses about a decade-and-a-half long trend where voter registrations have not kept up with population growth. For the last 4 years, they have exceeded population growth. So all of this means there are a lot of actors in the political realm, a lot of voters who have not been participating, and it's unclear at this point exactly who these folks are and exactly where they sit politically and what their attitudes might be coming into Election Day. Is also posing incredible challenges to pollsters to try to model this new turnout as it was in 2018 here in Texas. And while polling models are getting better, there's still a lot of uncertainty when this many more voters show up than have ever shown up before. Another indication that the state is extraordinarily competitive this year is the record-smashing contribution totals that candidates have been reporting in competitive congressional and state legislative states here in Texas. So what this chart is demonstrating is the amount of contributions reported by the Democrat and Republican running for the seats that I am currently listing as lean or toss-up, including a couple of likely Democratic seats that flipped in 2018, comparatively over recent years. And you can see that the 2020 numbers are far in excess of prior year numbers, suggesting that there is significant acknowledgement among the political parties and their larger donors that this is a highly competitive year here in Texas. These figures exclude any outside spending from groups, which would leave tens of millions of dollars not on this chart, particularly in the congressional races, where spending by independent committees is approaching an all-time high. And it also excludes on the congressional side the $48.4 million reported in contributions by Senator John Cornyn and M.J. Hagar, which are almost evenly split between the two of them. What these figures do include is a $13 million infusion of cash into congressional campaigns over the 2-week period that ended around the middle of October, and $39 million infused into Texas State House races over the past month. At least with respect to the State House numbers, that is 6 times the amount that came into these same races 2 years ago over that same month-long period of time. In 2018, which was at that time considered a fairly competitive election, the largest combined contribution total for a state house race in the final month before the election was $576,000. That's the Democrat and the Republican running together, that combined total, $576,000. That was the largest number in 2018. So far, in 2020, that number is, there are 20 seats that are over $1 million. A significant increase in the amount of money that's coming into these races. And some of it is coming in really high numbers. House District 67, which is in Collin County, that's Jeff Leach's seat, $3 million between the two candidates over the past month. HD 112, which is Andy Chen Button's seat in North Dallas, $2.5 million. Steve Allison's seat in San Antonio, HD 121, the two candidates combined for $2.4 million in the past month. And in HD 97, Craig Golden's seat in Fort Worth, it's $2.1 million. Numbers also very high on the congressional side, led by CD2, which is Dan Crenshaw's seat in the greater Houston area. Those two candidates have raised $8.5 million in the last quarter. CD7, which is also in the Houston area, Wesley Hunt and drawing a blank, Lizzie Fletcher, $6.2 million. And in CD21, Chip Roy and Wendy Davis, $6 million. That's in the Austin, San Antonio Hill Country area. All of this is to say then that, and I love this quote from the Washington Post, again, as a more provocative statement than an assertion of fact. And it's that Trump's first term has largely unified the American left. This was a large block of voters that was incredibly fractured in 2016 after a very bitter primary race between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, in which a significant swath of Bernie Sanders voters did not come back to the polls in November. We saw in 2018 that in Texas, at least, Beto O'Rourke was able to capture some of those voters, bring them back to the polls, and it's our suspicion that that is happening again here in 2020 as a reaction to Trump's first term in office. And so for a variety of reasons, 2020 is like no presidential election we've ever seen here in Texas. For one thing, it's extremely close, something that has not happened in many, many years. We know that record turnout is a certainty. I have given a similar presentation to this 4 times now, and I've upped my record turnout number from 9 to 11 to 12 and now 13 million Texans as a potential estimate for where turnout will cap out. We know that there will be record absentee voting. Fortunately, in Texas, those absentee votes are counted before Election Day in most large counties, on Election Day in the smaller ones. So we should have those vote totals when early voting totals are announced. There are other states in the country, including some swing states like Pennsylvania, that do not count these votes until after the election. And so there may be some mystery as to the overall outcome of the presidential race for a few days while some of those states are counting votes. Here in Texas, Trump's unpopularity, particularly among women, independents, and I would add now college-educated Anglo voters, is creating a really difficult climate for Republicans, at least in terms of what they have faced for the past generation. One of the potential outcomes of all this is a split government in 2021. The House Democrats need 9 seats to take the lower chamber after gaining 12 net seats in 2018. We know that there's no more straight party option, so that voters will have to go through the ballot from top to bottom. We know that in 2018, 2 out of every 3 voters cast a straight party ballot, which was the highest in state history and the highest mark of any state that offered the straight party option in the past 20 years. And on top of all of this, there remains a coronavirus pandemic, social unrest issues, and matters that may simply, for some voters, dwarf other considerations, including their typical party preference when they come to the polls in record numbers. The polling environment is much different than in 2016, both here in Texas and nationally. Joe Biden here in the state has more support than Hillary Clinton had in nearly every poll to date. Importantly, Clinton never led Donald Trump in a poll here in Texas. Biden has been ahead several times, including 7 times in the last 2.5 months, almost always within the margin of error, although I would say that about Donald Trump's lead as well. We just had 4 major significant polls come out over the weekend on Monday, 2 of them showing Joe Biden ahead, 2 of them showing Donald Trump ahead. Trump's lead slightly larger than Biden's lead, and all of it within the margin of error. One of the things that is driving this is independents who are swinging away from Trump, unlike the way they did in 2016 when they swung toward him, or probably more accurately away from Hillary Clinton. There are also far fewer undecided voters this year than in 2016. And then there's this. This was an insight from the New York Times Siena College poll that came out on Monday. They looked across specifically 12 predominantly suburban congressional districts that cook political rates as competitive and that I rate as either a toss-up or a lean Republican or Democrat. That poll found that Joe Biden was ahead of Donald Trump by 5 points, 48-43 in those districts. These same districts, Trump carried them by 8 points in 2016. In that same poll, Anglo college-educated voters were favoring Trump by just 2 points in those 12 districts. In 2016, Trump won that demographic by 24 points. These districts and this swath of voters, particularly now suburban women and college-educated men, are part of what is college-educated women are part of what is making the suburban districts particularly competitive, even as Republicans are making significant gains in rural areas. In that New York Times Siena poll, it found that rural Texans favor Donald Trump by an 80-15 margin. So if you can imagine the highway speed limit signs in West Texas, those are the kinds of percentages that Republicans have been getting in rural areas, and they will continue to do that. And so let's talk about those rural areas for a moment. Texas has a rural population larger than the population of 26 states in their entirety. And this has been a reliable block of around 1 million to 1.25 million net votes for Republicans for a couple of decades now. So what this chart is, this table shows you is the net vote margin by each party in brackets of counties by size, from 500,000 registered voters and up to 20,000 and down. I classified them based on where they are today. So if a county today has 500,000 registered voters or more, I keep them in the same line across. So we're comparing the same set of counties across time. What we can see is that at the very bottom, the overall margin in the state, Republican presidential candidate George Bush won in 2004 by 1.7 million votes. In 2016, Donald Trump won by approximately half that, 807,000 votes. And in 2018, which I've included here among the presidential elections because it was such a high turnout election, won by 215,000. If you look at those 2 rows below that, I've split the state essentially into 2 groups. Smaller counties with 250,000 or fewer registered voters, that is the bulk of the counties in Texas. Counties with 250,000 or more registered voters. You can see in that middle line, the larger counties have swung quite dramatically toward the Democrats in the last 15 years, while the smaller counties have stayed fairly steady, slight increase in presidential election years, but not a lot of growth there in that stronghold area. Knowing that this block exists, and with my suspicion that the Trump campaign is doing everything it can to reach voters in those counties and bring them out, I expect that margin will go up this year, not only because of that outreach effort, but simply those counties have been trending more Republican for 20 years now. That trend should continue, and our model, in fact, projects that it will. So that means that Democrats, in order to win a statewide race, have to more than make up for that in the larger counties. If you just draw the math from 12 through 16 through 18, you get to where it's pretty close. And so if the trends continue over the last few years, that also confirms that Texas will be a very close state this year. And in fact, this is posing an issue long-term for the Republican Party, not just in 2020. If you've been, as many of you are, so I know this is a very political group, the Democrats since around 1998 have said that demographics and population growth will eventually go in their favor. I'm not sure we're quite there yet, but certainly these kinds of trends suggest that that is slowly coming to fruition. You can see here since 2016, about 550,000 new voter registrations in the counties less than 250,000 that are reliably Republican on balance, 1.2 million new voter registrations in the larger counties that have been trending more and more Democratic, and that trend has been accelerating since Trump's presidency. Jeff mentioned when we got started that I have the most comprehensive data set on straight party voting in Texas. Straight party voting was ended by the legislature in 2017. And by that, I mean the ability to push one lever, pull one lever, push one button, or make some other single mark to vote for all candidates of a single party. Coast voters are still able to vote all Republican, all Democrat, or all minor party down the ballot, as they always have been. That has always been a very big determinant in election results here in Texas, that straight party voting by itself determines most of how races are going to turn out. What was interesting, particularly in the last couple of election cycles, is that Democrats have been drawing ever closer with everybody else. These are people I call full ballot voters. They didn't vote a single punch straight party. They actually walked through the ballot from top to bottom. And for the first time since the late 1970s, but my data goes back to 86. My suspicion is this goes back into the late 70s, probably up until Ronald Reagan's first election in 1980. For the first time, Democrats actually won a majority of these full ballot voters in the top race on the ballot, which in 2018 was the O'Rourke-Cruz election. So where are we politically? What is the mood of the state and its electorate, at least to the extent that we are able to accurately sample it from a polling standpoint? This is data taken longitudinally from the University of Texas Politics Projects and the Texas Tribune polls, which have been conducted 3 or 4 times a year since late 2009. You can certainly see on the left side, that is Texans' view of how the nation is going, whether it is on the right track or on the wrong track. On the right-hand side, their view toward the state. We can see that something happened in late 2016 that flipped the Republicans and Democrats over. Of course, we know what that is. That was the election of Donald Trump's presidency. Everything prior to that was during the Obama presidency. What I want you to really pay attention to is those last few data points on the far right. We see that Republicans' views of the nation are increasingly heading toward a neutral position, so not as favorable as it has been. Independents have been trending downward, and Democrats who have been downward for some time are even slightly more downward. On the state side, we also have some of the same types of phenomenon, although Democrats are, at least in the most recent poll, a little more favorable toward the state's track than they have been. That may be polling error, that may be a true sentiment. But in any case, certainly since the coronavirus came into our collective consciousness, the views of the nation and the state are that we are not on the right track, or at least less so as before. Why this is important to me is that this year is looking an awful lot to me like 2010. I am having some deja vu about the 2010 election. And that year, if you will recall, was a wipeout for Democrats. They went from a 76-74 two-seat minority in the House to a 99-51 minority. And then through party switches, it became 101 Republicans to 49 Democrats. And they stayed in that kind of zone through 2017. In 2018's election, they gained back 12 of those seats that they lost. So I like to think of 2010 as being kind of a one-act play. Everything happened in one election cycle, this tremendous crash of the Democratic Party here in Texas, mostly in response to Barack Obama's initial part of the presidency. You had two things: tremendous dislike by Republicans that helped to fuel the Tea Party movement, and tremendous disappointment on the part of progressive Democrats who were dismayed that one of Obama's first major policy moves was bailing out Wall Street. Flash forward 10 years, and we see some of these same trends. The party in the White House, the voters of the party in the White House have a lower opinion of their national course of action than they did previously. Independent voters are near a low, and the party out of power, of course, thinks everything is terrible, as they have for several years now. So what's the big picture then? And we've just revised some of these numbers today. We will do another model run tonight, which may shift some of this a little bit. But you see our projected turnout would be over 70%. 70% turnout in Texas has not occurred since 1988, and that was the only time it's happened in the last 50 years. We do expect Republicans will sweep the statewide races. We think the Democrats will gain the one competitive seat in the state Senate. We are currently projecting Democrats to gain enough seats to take a nominal majority in the state House. And this perhaps the most surprising for folks nationally, we expect that the Democrats will gain enough seats to split the delegation evenly, but still lose the Senate seat, which will keep it in Republican hands. On the far right, you see our current projected vote totals for President Trump and Joe Biden, an 0.8 of a point separation. That would be the closest race in Texas in many, many years, and a 8.2% percentage point drop in Trump's margin of victory from 2016. The next few slides we'll go through fairly quickly, but as I know many of you from all across Texas, you'll want to take a moment to look for the races that are in your area. So I will highlight a few and just let you look for some of the rest of them. If they are not listed, they are either safe Republican or they are safe Democrat. So we begin in the statewide realm. We believe that aside from the presidential election that I have rated as toss-up, all the other statewide seats are lean Republican and projected to remain there. There are very few competitive seats in the Senate, one in particular, Senate District 19, which stretches from San Antonio out to West Texas. We expect will flip. That was a long-held Democratic seat that became Republican in a special election. We think general election voters will course correct that and send it back to the Democrats. Interestingly, there are 4 Republican-held Senate seats that I would rate a toss-up or lean Republican if their election had been this year, but they were on the ballot in 2018 and won't be again until 2022. The House is much more competitive than it has been in a long time. And we, as I said, we're projecting 10 seats to flip. Most of these are in urban, suburban areas in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and the Harris-Fort Bend County areas. In fact, looks like all of them are those things. The thing that I'm really watching this year, the county I'm most fascinated by is Tarrant County. So in 2018, Dallas County is where all the action was, as 5 Republican state legislators and a Republican state senator was defeated, and a Republican congressman was defeated in that general election. But Tarrant County also was interesting in that Beto O'Rourke was the first Democratic U.S. Senate candidate to carry Tarrant County since 1988. And he also carried Williamson County, which had not been done by a Democrat in quite some time. If the Texas House is going to have a Democratic speaker in 2021, it's critically important to the Democrats that Tarrant County continue its trend toward Democratic candidates. We are projecting 2 seats to flip now, Jonathan Stickland's open seat, Bill Zedler's open seat, but there are 2 more that are in the toss-up category and another one in the lean Republican category that is on the edge of being a toss-up based on our model. So to me, the big action is going to be Tarrant County, a little bit of the action in North Dallas area, That's where House District 66 and 67 in Collin County are. House District 112, which is Angie Ten Button's district in North Dallas, and then Morgan Meyer's district in Central Dallas, in a highly educated area of Central and North Dallas. We actually see is all the way over in the likely Democratic category. If these projections hold, that would mean there would be no Republican state representatives in Dallas County for the first time since there were any Republican state representatives, which has been quite a while. I'm happy to come back to this slide for specific questions, or if folks have not quite found all of their members that they're concerned about, or the candidates that their PACs are supporting or opposing locally. Let's move on for just a moment to our congressional ratings. Again, we are projecting Cornyn to have a fairly small, but in fact slightly larger victory over MJ Hagar than Ted Cruz had. That margin simply because Hagar's name ID remains quite a bit lower than Beto O'Rourke's was during the 2018 campaign. And there's been significantly less money and less organizational effort on the ground to support her campaign. That said, there are tens of millions of dollars in outside money coming into the race on both sides. And Cornyn's campaign may inadvertently be lifting Hagar's name ID by using her image, likeness, and name in a bunch of their ads that at least I've seen here in Central Texas. And coming from Austin, I don't see many political ads, so this has been kind of a treat this year to see so many. We see our current projections of 5 seats flipping over to the Democrats from the Republican side. The toss-up seats of those, I would say Taylor's is the closest to then joining them, followed by Crenshaw. I think John Carter's seat is safer than my model suggests that it is, but their very high turnout in parts of Williamson County are part of what's pushing that. One can imagine a world in which Hagar were running in CD 31 and O'Rourke were running for Senate again instead of his ill-fated presidential run, in which case we might be talking about moving some more seats over, but that is not what we have as our reality today. So if these results hold, that would split the congressional delegation, 18 Democrats and 18 Republicans, 2 U.S. senators who are Republican, going into the next Congress. The end of this is just a reflection on what happened to cause the Democrats' decline. Texas was a blue state for more than a century, from Reconstruction until the early 1990s, although Republicans did win at the statewide level and had gains at the local and legislative level through that period of time. The Democrats did collapse sometime around 1994, 1996, and have stayed fairly marginalized until recent years. What we saw that led broadly to that decline, we are seeing signs of now with the party in power. As I know, this is a slide from an October 2016 presentation, unchanged, but for the fact that that lower headline now says that instead of what it said at the time. The growing schism within the majority party. Many of you probably are aware that the state Republican chairman and a statewide elected official were protesting a Republican governor here in Austin just a couple of weeks ago. We know that the Tea Party movement and various actors within the Republican Party have been fighting over how conservative different folks should be in the legislature for some time now. Texas at odds with Washington, that clearly is evident from the opinions of folks who believe that we are on the wrong track. There needed to be a culture change of non-participation to bring more people into the election process. Clearly, we're seeing that now. We need new coalitions of voters. Beto O'Rourke put together a coalition that didn't previously exist of suburban voters, young voters, and Latino vote, well, not Latino voters, and African American voters in certain parts of the state, as well as Asian American voters who had been largely left on the sidelines by the campaigns over the years, and then to compete up and down the ballot, which we are seeing the Democrats doing in the last 2 election cycles, far, far, far more than they did in any election cycle leading up to that. And that is all I have prepared. I'm happy to take some questions. As I said, I'm happy to also go back to any of those race rating charts and give you all some more time to look at those, and I will take questions.
All right, Jeff, that was a great presentation. We do have the first question is about the presidential race. Do you believe that many Trump supporters are waiting until November the 3rd to vote for President Trump to put him over the top?
It's possible, certainly very possible. I think that has been the strategy, at least in terms of the messaging the campaign has been putting out, and the president's own warnings about mail voting and encouraging his partisans to go vote on Election Day. I will say that is counter to a lot of strategies that have been employed lately, particularly with such a large early voting period. Most campaign strategists I talk to would tell me they'd rather bank their votes early than wait for the whims of Election Day. And it may depend in part, too, on whether voters who are marginally Trump supporters, who are not particularly frequent voters, decide on Election Day that their vote's really going to matter or make a difference, or they may become more indifferent and stay home. That said, there are a lot of folks who still have not voted, including more than 1 million Republican primary voters. So there is definitely a big block of votes still out there. My personal prediction on Election Day is that early voting will trend much more favorably toward Democrats than Election Day. My hunch is that at between 7 and 8 p.m., when early voting results are out, Democrats will be ahead, perhaps way ahead in a number of races. Euphorically so for the Democratic faithful, and we will watch over the evening as those numbers are clawed back by higher percentages of Republicans voting on Election Day. That I do believe is going to happen. Will it be enough? We'll see.
Okay. I have another question. End of straight ticket voting has been a hot topic for a while now. How do you think that will affect races further down the ballot?
Well, we expect there will be a drop-off down the ballot. We don't know where that will occur or how big it will be. There's already naturally a block of voters, there are around 500,000 or so of them in 2016, who vote the presidential line and then nothing else. And then there's a handful of voters who vote a local election line and nothing else. Everyone else votes some degree of the ballot from top to bottom, or as they did before, just check the straight party option. We know from North Carolina's elimination of straight party voting that drop-off wasn't very big, but they had an advantage there in that their ballots aren't very long. They don't elect judges in North Carolina as we do. So in Harris County, when there's 90 races on a ballot, we will see how much drop-off there is and where that point is. I think the most interesting aspect of the elimination of straight party voting is what happens when a voter who has typically marked that straight R or straight D box but doesn't participate in primary elections goes down a ballot and sees names they've never seen before because they've never actually voted for any of these individual candidates down the ballot. And we'll see if there is enthusiasm to vote for them, or alternatively, if they reach a candidate who, for some reason, they may not support as well, they used to be able to vote for them without voting for them by casting a straight ballot. Now they have to affirmatively put a check mark by someone's name. And so we will see if that causes a little bit of differentiation around some candidate quality that has previously been wiped away by just the wave of straight party voting.
Okay, we have just a couple more questions here and a little bit of time left. What is causing the shift in Texas political districts? Are people moving into the area, increased number of residents registering, or something else?
I think you've got a little bit of everything. I think the state is diversifying in terms of its population. I think that the prosperity of the last dozen or so years coming out of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009 has lifted a number of folks into better economic positions, which make them then a little bit more attuned into voting. I think you have seen because of high real estate prices, as you all are very much aware of in the urban core, you're watching particularly younger voters moving farther out away from the city and moving into the suburbs, smaller families moving into the suburbs, which is changing the way Collin County and Williamson County and Denton County and Fort Bend County are voting. And then just there are certainly out-of-state folks who are coming in. I think they are, on balance, neither Republican nor Democratic. They are coming to Texas largely for the economic prosperity and opportunity that was here. And then there's just simply a lot more interest since Trump's election in 2016 in terms of what's going on. That's been heightened by the pandemic and the economic problems that the state and the nation and the world, frankly, are facing today.
Okay. Interesting.
I'll add one other thing to that. All right, one of the ways that we model data is we look at long-term trends of districts. And so it isn't a recent phenomenon. You know, when we look at a district such as House District 60, Congressional District 2, that is Dan Crenshaw's district in the Houston area. That district was about 22 points redder than the state as a whole in 2002. It has been slowly drifting toward parity to the point that in 2018 it was exactly as red or blue as the state as a whole. It was perfectly right in the center. And the expected trend is it will continue toward now becoming slightly bluer than the state as a whole. Depending on how red or blue the state is as a whole, that puts that district more and more in play.
All right, I have another one. What is the most interesting race in Texas, in your opinion?
Wow. Most interesting race in Texas. Well, I guess it's probably the presidential race, simply because we are in an uncharted territory of competitiveness and interest in that. I'd say from a just individual district race, probably the most interesting race to me is Congressional District 21 between freshman rep Chip Roy and former Fort Worth Senator and Democratic gubernatorial candidate Wendy Davis, and the fact that the demographic changes there, the voter participation changes there, particularly in Hayes County, and then the ever-bluing Travis County, has swung a seat that 6 years ago I would never have told you was going to be competitive into one that a candidate just fairly reviled by Republicans statewide, fairly loved by progressives across the country, is in striking distance of winning a seat that actually includes hill country counties that are just ruby red. And I find that the shifts there in particular to be quite fascinating.
Okay, I'll go to one question about current events. I think I saw in the paper this morning that Governor Abbott has deployed or will deploy the Texas National Guard in 5 of the major cities in Texas. We've had a lot of civil unrest in our communities that we serve throughout the state. What is your opinion on that, and how does that look on November the 4th? Well,
it saddens me that we're at a place that we can't seem to get along civilly, at least folks on certain sides, with folks on other sides, that we are to that point that we may need some additional protection. I saw in the papers yesterday that a ballot box collection site in Boston, Massachusetts was set on fire and destroyed over the weekend, and that those kinds of incidents, the election process is sensitive to those kinds of incidents, particularly in close areas. And so to the extent that added security is protecting the process and the assets and the people, then that may be where we are. Of course, the state has a history, and I am not saying that Abbott is doing this or this is the intent or this is the effect, but the state has a history of voter intimidation in certain areas of the state. And I would be very disheartened if the Guard deployment or any other sort of show of force would lead folks to not want to vote. I think it's critically important. I hope we all agree that it's critically important that anyone who is lawfully able to cast the ballot has the opportunity to do so and have that ballot counted, regardless of how the outcome of the election is or what we think that particular ballot's going to say.
Thank you. We have one last question here before we wrap up, and that is, what is the takeaway you would like to leave our members with about this election?
I would say this. I think this is a historically important election. I would say wherever you are on the political spectrum and whatever outcome you seek, I would encourage all of you to call 10 of your friends or neighbors in the next day or so and ask them if they voted. And if they have not, ask them what their plan is to vote, and then follow up with them to make sure that they vote. I think when we are at this sort of a crossroads nationally where two very different visions of the path forward are presented, as many of us who have the ability to cast a vote and have a voice in that should do so. So I would encourage all of you to reach out and do that. I say my second takeaway goes back to my provocative question, which could Donald Trump turn Texas blue? If it does, it's temporary. We are not to a point, I think, where this is would be a long-term switchover. In fact, I would say, honestly, if I were forecasting what would be the best outcome for Democrats in Texas, it would be a Donald Trump reelection. And likewise, I would say the best outcome for Republicans in terms of their future electoral prospects in Texas, it's a Joe Biden presidential election victory.
Well, Jeff, thank you again. That was great. I appreciate you joining us today and giving our members an expert viewpoint of the election and a behind-the-scenes look at some of the analytics that go into elections. You've given us a lot of insider knowledge and what we should expect going into Election Day. And just a reminder to all realtors watching from across the state, you can keep up with the latest news from Jeff Blaylock by subscribing to Texas Election Source and using the promo code TREPAC to receive 50% off of your subscription. And now, speaking of news, up next, we have a great panel with Texas journalists on how we as realtors can ensure that our advocacy messages are getting out to the public.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Good morning, Texas Realtors. I'm Jaime Lee. I have the privilege of serving as your Director of Advocacy Communications. I'll introduce you to our guests, but I first want to say many thanks to Jeff Farnell, our 2021 Political Involvement Chairman, for leading the previous session with Jeff Blaylock. Jeff covered a lot of candidate races on the ballot, but there is another aspect to realtor advocacy that is just as critical, and that is issues. Think about things like property taxes, private property rights, infrastructure, schools. Realtors can play a significant role in local issues too. So a couple housekeeping items. I'd like to remind our viewers that all sessions during orientation are being recorded. You can watch them on demand through the attendee hub, in addition to watching them live. This session is titled Meet the Press. And if you've been catching some of the trivia playing before our sessions, here's another fun fact. Those of you familiar with the real TV show Meet the Press may know is the longest running program in television history. Thought that was fitting for our TRTV news theme this year. So another fun fact for you to share. For this session, we are grateful that we have 3 working journalists in Texas here to share their insights. And in fact, I was warned that breaking news could happen at any moment. So let's get right to it. Joining us today are Corey McLagan, Managing Editor for Texas Tribune, Jaime Lee, Anchor and Reporter for TV station KView in the Austin area, and Amy Denny, who is Community Impact Newspaper's Managing Editor for the Austin metro area. All of their outlets cover the Texas Capitol, but also cover local issues and the local impact of statewide issues. Our goal is to have them provide their advice for realtors who are looking to build relationships with journalists in their own local markets and help realtors become sources for information about local real estate related issues. So thank you all for being here. We appreciate your time. Let's dive in. To avoid any crosstalk, I'll direct my questions to you individually by name as much as possible and invite you to respond. First, would each of you please introduce us to your outlets, telling us what makes it unique and describing who is your audience. Amy, will you start, please?
Sure, thank you, Jamie. So my name is Amy, and I am with Community Impact Newspaper. We are a hyper-local community publication. We've been around for 15 years, started in the Round Rock, Pflugerville, Hutto area, and we have since grown statewide and even out of Texas, and we now have 32 publications, mostly in Texas, but we also have 2 in Arizona and 1 in the Nashville area, and we are actively growing. So I oversee 9 papers in our Austin area from Georgetown all the way down to New Braunfels. And what makes us different from community publications people may remember from growing up is, we're reporting on like what's happening in people's backyards. They're always curious of like what's going on down the street. Why are they tearing up this road? What's happening with the schools? What are our elected officials doing with our funding? And then real estate is a huge component of everything. It overlaps with so many different stories, that we cover. And so people are always wanting to know, like, where do I need to move my family? We have so many new people moving from out of Texas into our markets. We're in high growth areas. Housing is one of the utmost important topics that we aim to cover. So really excited to be talking to all of you.
Thank you very much. Corey, tell us about the Tribune.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So the Texas Tribune is an 11-year-old news organization. We cover Texas government and politics, and we're digital, so we don't actually print anything on paper. And what makes us sort of unique is that we're a nonprofit organization. So we get funding from foundations, from individual donors. You can be a member of the Texas Tribune just like you can be a member of your public radio station. And all of our stories are free to read, and we give away our stories for free to other news organizations. So you may read Texas Tribune stories in the El Paso Times or in the Amarillo Globe News. They will publish our stories. Most of our reporters are in Austin, but we also have reporters in Dallas, in Houston, in El Paso, and we have a bureau in Washington, D.C. as well that covers the Texas congressional delegation. We are all about politics, elections, the legislature, so our audience tends to be people who are interested in those things, but you know what, we think those things are actually applicable to all Texans. So those decisions they're making at the Capitol about healthcare or education or taxes, these are things that really all Texans should care about. So we really see everyone in Texas or people outside of Texas who care about Texas as being our audience. We tell stories in a lot of different ways. So we have traditional text stories, but we also have data-driven stories. Like, for example, we have a coronavirus tracker right now. We have real-time data-driven results on election night. We have newsletters. So there's a coronavirus newsletter right now, but we also have something called The Brief, which is our daily free newsletter, everything you need to know about what's going on at the Capitol. We have podcasts, including our signature politics podcast, which is called TREPAC. We have live events, which are normally in person, but are right now on Zoom, where we interview public officials. And then we have videos. So we tell, if you look up a video series called Split Decision, it's a really fun series where we have candidates like Senator John Cornyn and his Democratic challenger, MJ Hagar. It's almost like a debate, but they're not actually in the same room. It's just a video, but it's a real fun way to get a sense of what's going on in that race. So that's the Texas Tribune in a nutshell.
Cool, thank you. Jenny?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Not related to Jaime Lee, although I feel a connection with her, right? So my name is Jaime Lee. I'm the Hayview weekend anchor over at the ABC affiliate here in town. And so even though we're located in Austin, Texas, we really can be seen anywhere thanks to this little device, right? You can just log on, watch us live anywhere. We're part of the TechNet Corporation. We have, I think, some 49 stations across the United States. We can be seen. I think we reach 50 million people every month, digital, social, everywhere, which is why I'm always stressed out 24 hours a day. And ask Jamie. She tried to reach me yesterday, and I was freezing my bum off outside during these winter temps in the fall. Makes no sense. We're in Texas, right? So that's KV. We cover everything. So not just politics. I'm a general assignments reporter, so COVID-19 is the big story of the day. Elections is a big story of the day. Everything is a big story of the day. So it's weather is a big story of the day. What's not the big story of the day? So everything. What's important to you is important to us. So that's KView. It's really, we're community oriented. Our focus is what makes our community better. One of our big initiatives for the past couple of years, Boomtown. Realtors are important to us because, as you guys know, the crazy growth in our Austin area right now. So we've been really focused on that. I talk to realtors a lot. I have a few of my favorite that are my go-to realtors to just kind of tell me about, hey, why are we seeing this trend? What's going on here? So I'm really glad to be part of this panel. Thanks for having me, guys.
That is a perfect segue into my first line of questioning for y'all. So when you're working on a story, you're working to cover a local issue or a statewide issue from a local perspective, what is your process? Tell us what it looks like for you to produce your story, whether that's digital or print or broadcast. And I'm assuming it's not just, here's my idea, type, and you're done. Like, there's work into it. So, Corey, could you talk to us a little bit about what that looks like for your team?
Yeah, sure. So if it's news that we know is going to happen, we can actually write it in advance. So an example of that would be a bill that's going to be voted on the floor of the Texas House. And we might write it two different ways. Like, here's the version of the story if it passes, and here's the version of the story if it doesn't pass. And we can do all that research in advance. How might it affect people in different parts of the state? What are the pro and con arguments for and against it? And then we can have that story all ready to go. And when the vote happens, we can just plug in that vote and publish the story. And that doesn't mean it's done, though. So we'll be wanting to seek feedback and reaction and constantly update that story. That's the thing about being digital only. We're just constantly updating. But of course, other times we don't know the news is going to happen, or other times there's something sort of deeper that we want to explore. So the idea could come from a reporter, or it could come from an editor, or it could come from a reader. And say we want to look at a topic like, how is coronavirus affecting schools this year? And so the reporter will take some time and talk to teachers and talk to students and talk to parents and figure out how to tell that story and write that story. And then the editor will get the story and might have questions and might ask the reporter to talk to more people and might work with the words in that story to improve it. But we as editors are not just looking at words, we're also looking at what are the best photos we can use to tell this story visually. What is the best way to share this story on social media, on Twitter and on Facebook? But when you think about then Instagram, is there a more visually focused way that we can share that story? And what's the headline that will explain this in a way that's really clear to help the reader understand what it's about?
Amy, can you add anything to that? What does it look like for your team, for your print product especially, but also for your large digital presence?
Yeah, so we do a lot of similar things that Corey mentioned, but for our print product, because that's, one of the things that is so unique about us is, it comes out monthly, so we do have a little bit extra time to seek out those unique sources. And whether it's a hyper local event that's happening in just one of our markets or something at the state level, like we feel like there's always, we call them the average Joes and Janes. There's always an average person that we can go and talk to about how is this issue or trend affecting you. And sometimes it takes a while to be able to connect with those people. So our reporters will spend a lot of time seeking out those sources initially. The other thing that we really kind of pride ourselves on is our data journalism and explaining the data that we find. And so we're always trying to figure out, especially for trend stories, like how can we show this trend is happening or changing over time. And so sometimes that means submitting information requests for that data, and those take time to get back. So we do a lot of planning ahead. sometimes up to 2-3 months out on issues that we know we need to cover, just to give us the time to find the local sources and to find that data. And then once we have all the information, the story is written, it's been edited, we go into like graphic brainstorm sessions where the team will meet together and we'll talk over, here's the story, how do we think visually we need to put this information on the cover? So that could be charts. Sometimes we do a photo overlaid with what we call it by the numbers. So kind of like 2, 3, 4 notable numbers that we're able to glean from analyzing the data. So we can use that on a picture. And we also have, we do tons of charts. And so like charts are great for print, but for online, what we try to do is to take those charts and make them interactive. So it's an additional step to not just, have like a static image that we upload with the story after it is delivered to the reader, but then we want to make it like an interactive experience so that they can like click through the data, like, see the chart and how it changes over time. So we have to consider not only the print, which we call our bread and butter, but, and everyone's digital now. And so digital, you're able to update things a little bit more real time. So we also have to take that extra step of thinking about how is the story going to look online as well.
Cool. Thank you, Amy. Jenny, speaking of online, you mentioned your phone. What is it like for you on the broadcast side of putting a package together?
So it starts, actually, it's 24 hours a day. We're always looking. As a reporter, all reporters are always looking for stories, right? And then so we take our pitches to our daily, we have editorial meetings a couple of times a day. For me, as a dayside reporter, our editorial meeting is 9:30. At 9:30, we take our pitches to our managers and producers, and as peon reporters, they decide what we do that day. And as soon as they decide what we do that day, depending on the news of the day, because all stories are pretty good. Depending on the news of the day, they give it to us. We hit the ground running. We make our calls, set it up. We got the interviews, do more research, find more data, and then put the story together, write, log, which is the worst thing in the world, right? You're transcribing the interviews. I hate it. Get approval from supervisors, and then you put the story together. And then after you write it, you're not done. You have to do social media. You have to write different versions of the story. And then you're still not done. You have to do lives for the 5 and the 6. Write more versions for digital. Then you have to collab and do other versions. So even after you get home, the work's not done. So I'm trying to condense it and put it in a nutshell, because there's so much to do in the broadcast world. Because once upon a time, you did one story. After that one story, you were done. And then digital came and ruined our lives, or expanded and fulfilled our lives. It depends on how you want to see it. And it's all because of this, because all the eyeballs went from the TV and went here, and we all had to reimagine how we do our business, right? So, because all the younger kids are going to this, and we all had to, and Amy and Corey knows, how to, do our business on here. So then we have to do Facebook Lives, and how do we get people to look at our stories here? And so we have to, do our stories and make it more attractive on here. So, so I have to rewrite my story. And how do we do that on Instagram? And how do we do it on Facebook and LinkedIn? And so, we have to rewrite our story so many different ways. So, it's interesting, and it's a challenge and a struggle, but a learning experience every day, because different stories require different formats. So, it's interesting.
So a consensus, the nutshells are getting bigger and bigger.
I know. I'm sorry. I try to condense that for you guys.
Well, it's perfect answer. I mean, I asked that question for our audience specifically to point out there are many ways that a realtor can be helpful to a journalist during that process, whether it's, as a realtor, are you the one who found the topic? Hey, did you know that my city is proposing X, Y, Z? Or being the source for background info and providing information, interviews, documents, or being the source to be quoted yourself. Or, realtors have these expansive networks within their own communities. Could a realtor put the reporter in contact with others who are in their vast network? So I'd be curious to ask each of you if you could tell me of an example of when a realtor has been helpful, or even a hypothetical example of when you can think of. If you don't mind, I'll start with Jenny. Let's see what's on your mind.
Well, I'm going to go back to my Boomtown series. I think if I can drop a name, because she's been so helpful to me, Soccer Tatum Thomas. Do y'all know her? She's well connected. She's a broker, and she just does great interviews. She knows what I'm looking for. So I go to her. She does not call me and say, can I be on TV? So she knows that I'm on a deadline, and she knows, because I have this much time. I really have a couple of hours to put together a story because I have a deadline. It needs to make air at 5. So I don't have 10 hours to put together a story. I have like 2. So she knows to make herself available. She knows to be presentable, and she knows not to be in, Sun Market. She knows I need to be in Central Austin. So she knows my challenges, and she makes herself, she knows my challenges, and she makes herself available. So she's great. And she has a wealth of information. She knows what she's talking about. She keeps herself abreast of all the trends. She's just fabulous. So I go to her, and she was in my How the Middle Class is Disappearing in my Boomtown recent piece. I want to say it was a few months ago. So that was when I used her last. But she's one of my favorite brokers / realtors to turn to when I do Boomtown stories or anything related to the real estate industry. So that's who I use. That's not the only person I use. That was the most recent example I can think of.
Sure. Amy, could you tell me a little bit about any examples you've had from community impact of either working with a realtor or potentially?
So every July we do our real estate edition, and that's focused on all things real estate, usually residential, because that is, mostly what people are interested in. And this year we were trying to tackle how has COVID-19 affected the process of buying a house. And I remember for our Southwest Austin paper, the writer reached out to a realtor and was able to find and connect with someone who was looking to buy a house. They were moving from a different state, and they weren't able to obviously come and tour the house in person. So it was really interesting. Like, he spoke to this person who I think was moving from my hometown, actually, of Kansas City, which I thought was interesting. And they wanted to move to Southwest Austin, and they did a virtual tour, and then decided to put in an offer on the house, basically sight unseen, except for what they could see on the video, which I assume was probably from a cell phone. And then he followed up with the woman after they moved here and was like, how do you like the house? And thankfully the woman loved the house, but it was all thanks to a connection that a realtor had set up. He was probably a client of theirs. And so I think that's what's really vital for us, is like we, going back to average Joes and Janes, of like how is an issue affecting the average Joes and Janes? These are our readers. And so I think the realtors can be really helpful in helping us find readers, especially from a very specific area. This was for the Southwest Austin paper. It was probably one particular neighborhood that they had noticed an increased interest in. The other thing that can be helpful is like on like a statewide issue. We love to like break down how statewide issues are affecting our readers. A challenge can be with disseminating that information and really getting people to understand like why they need to care about an issue. And there's no better way than to have like an anecdotal lead to a story of talking about one person's experience. And so realtors can be really helpful when we're trying to figure out, well, how is this issue with property taxes and this new legislation going to affect residents? And like, could we connect with a realtor and find somebody that way to, talk about that specific issue and talking about how it's going to affect this specific area of town. So that's been really helpful for us to find those like really local sources.
Sure. Corey, could you comment on any instances when the Texas Tribune has either worked with realtors or had the potential to work with one?
Yeah, sure. So when I was a reporter, whenever I would go into a community, especially if I'd never been to that part of Texas before, I would call realtors to try to get the lay of the land. And I really think a state legislative race would be a good example of something where a reporter could call a realtor and say, you know, how we understand this community, what are the hot issues, where are people moving in from, how has the area been changing, where are the coffee shops or restaurants or farmers markets where I can go to talk to people in this community, to talk to them about politics. So that could be really helpful. A more specific example of a time that we worked with a realtor was last legislative session. A reporter from the Texas Tribune, y'all at Texas Realtors put us in touch with a family. We were writing about a new law, Senate Bill 339, and it requires homeowners to disclose more information about flood risks and flood history where they sell their property. And y'all helped connect us with a couple that was surprised when their home in the Houston area flooded during Hurricane Harvey. They didn't realize that they were in a designated flood area, and they said they might not have moved to the area if they had known that. And so we were really able to bring that story to life in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do without that family in the story. Their dog, their corgi, was in the story, a dog named Cooper. You know, these kind of details that just sort of bring life to a legislative issue, and so that was really key. But we've also had times when I think our reporters wanted to talk to a realtor who we think could have helped with the story, and we weren't able to find a realtor that was willing to talk. And sometimes people get nervous about talking to reporters. So we have a great reporter in Dallas. His name is Juan Pablo Garnham, and he covers urban affairs, including housing issues around the state. And he was working on a story recently about the federal eviction moratorium, and he found tenants to talk to. And I know a lot of your members are landlords as well. And Juan Pablo was not able to find a landlord or a property manager who was willing to talk to him. And he felt like they missed an opportunity to explain how they were struggling and how the moratorium may affect them.
It's an excellent point, and that really is leading me to my next question is, okay, we have 130,000 plus members of our association at Texas Realtors, all across the state, every county, every community. Every community also has its own local media. And if realtors are seeking to be sources, whether it's on background or quoted themselves or putting someone in touch, how can a realtor go about initiating, fostering, building that relationship with media in their area? And Amy, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the best ways is just to be familiar with the publication or the news organization, just really understand the types of stories that they cover. I think everyone can agree there's nothing more annoying than getting a pitch from somebody and a follow-up, and it's clear they don't know who you are and what you do, and makes me really unlikely to want to read your email and even respond with a no thanks, I'm not interested. So I think some of the best ones are people who reach out. It's clear that they read our content. Maybe they receive, for us, maybe they receive the paper. They subscribe to our email newsletter. They read us online. And I think earlier it was mentioned, like, you have an idea and you just want to reach out and connect with us, and making sure that we know about the idea, and then just being available and willing to contact us back when we're trying to connect with you. Even though we at Community Impact are a monthly publication, our website is daily. We are constantly publishing information daily. So we don't have these super long time frames as people think. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we need something with a little quicker turnaround for our website, and then we might adapt something for our print publication. So just be super responsive and available, and I think just recognize the value that you can bring to the table, because you're working in the areas that we cover, and so you see things that maybe we don't see. The other thing is, like, if you're able to pull data for us, like sometimes we need data on like home sales or prices in a very specific neighborhood. So if you're able to bring that to the table, I think that's something that's very enticing to us.
That's great tips. Jenny, do you have any advice for realtors who would be looking to initiate or foster relationships with the reporters in their market?
I'm going to echo what Amy said. Know what we're about. And when you reach out, be responsive. I mean, that's so important. Don't call me the next day, because my story's for today, so tomorrow's too late. Don't call 4:30. I'm already done. Like, and that's fine if you didn't have time, but yeah, I'm already finished. That's really important. So responsive. I mean, that's everything I do. And when you do reach out, a cup of coffee, I'm not trying to be mean. I don't have time for a cup of coffee. I mean, just like Amy and Corey, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I've got a household to run, and election, COVID, weather, we have tons of things to do. So an email, if you're offering, and it's about developing relationships, right? It's not like you're gonna send an email, I'm gonna use you in the story. So be patient, and it's about trust, right? Let's see if the information that you're offering is a good news tip, and then we'll go from there. So my best sources are, it's been years in the making. So, it's baby steps. Those are my best sources. And it's, years in the making, but yeah, just baby steps. Let's move from the email to phone calls, and we'll go from there. But I like what Amy said. It is knowing the news outlet, knowing what we're about, knowing what I'm about, the kind of stories, and spell my name right. I mean, you wouldn't believe, like, yeah. But anyway, spell my name right. And when I reach back out to you, please respond immediately, and not like the next day and a couple of days from there. And then, I like what Amy said. I think I hit all the good points. And I also wanted to say this. You may not think you have something good to say, and you may think a phone call is on the record, but we can have a phone call that doesn't have to be on the record, and you have actually good information that you may not think is, relevant, but you have more good information than you think you do. We can just have, an off-the-record conversation, a background call, and it's fine. And if I can, this may be for a later in the panel discussion. When we do interviews, can we talk about this now, Jamie? Like, can we do just real quick? When we do interviews, and Amy and Corey, I'm sorry, we're jumping the gun. When we're doing interviews, maybe don't use like all your 50-cent words right away. Like, for me, we can't use them. Like, I know all of you are super smart, right? You're politically active realtors. Yay, I love this group. But like, I can't use them because I'm trying to be relatable. All my stories have to be relatable. We get one shot, like on live TV, to show it. I have to make it as understandable as possible. So be yourself. Like talk to me like you're talking to your neighbor, your kids. Don't try to sound like a professor, because if I wanted to talk to a professor, I'd go talk to a professor. So I wanted to get that out there. I didn't want to forget that. So, okay, I'm done.
That's a great point, and we'll bring that up in another question shortly, but great tips so far. Corey, do you have anything to add? Any advice for realtors who are looking to build, foster relationships, media in their area?
Yeah, I would just say keep in mind that journalists are people who live in your communities. I'm a native Austinite. My parents live here in Austin. My kids go to public schools here in Austin. And I'm looking to form relationships with people in my community, as I imagine y'all are as well. And I understand and respect that Jenny may be too busy to have a cup of coffee, but I think a lot of us at the Texas Tribune would love to have a cup of coffee. And if you reach out to one of us, we might say, you know what, I cannot right now. There's an election next week, or I cannot right now. There's a legislative session. But over the years, I've covered the Capitol since 2005, and over the years, I've formed a lot of great relationships with people who are loosely connected to the Capitol, and just gotten to know people over time. And so a lot of ways that we get story ideas is someone will ping me just because they know me, whether I've met them over the years at the Capitol or whether they coached my soccer team when I was in 3rd grade in Austin, just to say, hey, this is something that the Texas Tribune should look at. This is something going on in my community. And maybe it's not to do with their profession, but it's just something they noticed and that they think we should look into. So I think, I just think it's all about relationships.
All very good tips.
Corey, I agree. I didn't mean to say don't reach me. Don't ever. We're not going to have coffee. That cold pitches. If the first meeting is not going to be a cup of coffee, we can work up to that. Now news tips are great. Yeah, definitely send them. Look into this, that, and the other. But I can't as a TV person, I'm not going to meet you on our first. I have to be careful. Stalking and all that stuff. I'm not going to meet you on our first meeting. Yeah, I just have to be careful about that. But yes, send all the tips. Yeah, I just didn't want to give the wrong impression.
Sounds good.
That is a really good point. So if a realtor knows about a local issue that's coming up, an ordinance that's proposed, a council vote, county commission vote, and they have that information, you sound like you invite them to please reach out, literally call, email, and say, hey, did you know this thing is going on? And you, as professionals in your news teams, will know it's always triage, right? It's always what's the most important thing, the breaking news today, or what can we take a few days and really dive in on. So I'd like to ask a question. What is the best process that you found for culminating sources in this current environment? So with the pandemic and with social media, we are all accessible to each other almost 24/7. We're in our homes, and we're able to reach people in ways we couldn't before. Have you found that is changing the way that journalists are meeting the sources and making it easier, more accessible? And Corey, do you mind?
Yeah, so normally, in normal times, as an editor, I'm always telling reporters, get out of the newsroom, go talk to people, go to the Capitol, go to where the people are. And right now, we can't do that as often. And so one thing we're really relying on is social media and different digital tools to find people to talk to find stories. So we would do this anyway if there's not a pandemic, but it's just especially critical right now. So one of the things we have is we have these survey kind of things that we put in our stories. It's called a call out, and it'll say something like, help us cover coronavirus in Texas. And can you tell us who you are you a medical provider or not? Where are you located in the state? What's been your experience with COVID? And more than 20,000 people have filled out the coronavirus form on our website to give us a news tip. And so we can search through those and we can read them and say, okay, this one sounds like a story right away. Now we have to call and verify and research it. We wouldn't just publish it directly, but that's how we find out about it. Or if we're working on a story about, say, coronavirus in schools, we can search through all the people that have responded that say, I want to talk to you about coronavirus and I'm a teacher or I'm a student or I'm a parent, and then we can contact those people. And so it's these are ways that we're finding stories from being stuck at home.
Cool. Amy, have y'all had a similar experience at CI?
Yeah, so we also are the same. If we don't want to see our writers in the newsroom, we want to see them out meeting with sources at meetings. And usually when our writers are able to physically attend a meeting in person, they're able to see what residents go to those meetings. They have to connect them, and those are usually pretty good sources for stories. So it's been a challenge for us to try to find sources, honestly. And so we have had, like Corey said, to go digital and how can we connect with people online? We've had to rely a lot on our neighborhood contacts, like people we've previously have connected with. We have a lot of contacts with business owners, and so that's been one of the angles that we've really been focusing on with our coverage is how is the pandemic affecting businesses? And so we go to our archives, like who have we previously done a feature profile on? Can we follow up with them? We've also had to like use our neighborhood association contacts and try to see like if the neighborhood president in a certain area knows somebody who is affected by the subject that we're talking to. We also have a partnership with Nextdoor where we're able to post our content on there. And then we also ask questions to readers through Nextdoor of how are they being affected. And so that has resulted in a lot of useful tips and sources for our stories.
Cool. Jenny, I think I saw you nodding along. Do you have anything to add about how you're finding sources now these days?
Oh, I love Nextdoor. Besides the organic meeting parents through just at soccer games, at football games, gabbing, just literally outside my house. Nextdoor has been great. Copying what Corey said, our digital team is great. They do a push and here comes 1,000 answers. That's been wonderful as well. For me, it's been a blend of everything. So yeah, just digital and just a good old fashioned gabbing with people that's just been great too. So it's been a mix of everything for me, but just talking, digital, social, yeah, everything. And just tips, people writing in, emails, everything. Not so much phone calls anymore. I'm not at the office, so no phone calls. And then just my old years of developing sources, the relationships. So it's been a good blend and mix of just everything.
So a few of you, well, the Tribune is statewide. Jenny, you're in the Austin Metro. Amy, CI has a large presence around the metros in Texas. But we have many members who are in communities that are relatively rural, small populations, small to mid-sized market publications. Would you be able to comment on what it's like for those journalists who may be, sort of a one-man band locally, and how realtors could help them if it's providing, background information or things like that? Amy, I wonder if you could take that one and talk about your reporters who are out in these relatively smaller markets.
Yeah, so those areas, the news isn't as prevalent, I would say. We have some markets that we consider more newsy, like Round Rock. There's always stuff happening in Round Rock, but we do cover a few smaller communities in our metros. And, that's where we really have to rely on kind of like what Jenny was saying, the relationships. Some of our papers have been in these markets for many years. We've been able to cultivate relationships. And so I would say, take some of those tips that she had, and you just got to take some baby steps and like start small, connecting with those journalists, and really see how like, oh, I think we need to be covering this because X, Y, Z. So trying to figure out like put yourself in the shoes of the journalist of like, what do you think they might need to know? It's not just like, oh, I have this tip, but have you yourself like trying to figure out, well, I have this tip, but it's also affecting this person, so maybe they could potentially be a source. So trying to do some of that legwork to help them out, because journalists in these smaller communities, they often are like you said, one-man show. They're doing everything, and they're underwater a lot of the times trying to keep up with all of the demands of the news. And COVID has been hard. Like it's been every day there's like a breaking news story, and we're not all used to news breaking literally every day, every hour. It seems like some days. So just buying them a cup of coffee too. I'm sure they could use it as well. So hopefully that helps, but I think that's all I can think of off the top of my head.
Well, those are great tips. And Corey, I want to follow up with that for you. You mentioned that the Tribune, would it be accurate to say that you syndicate your content to publications, or how would you describe that? Is where I'm going with this is, how does the Tribune still reach those small markets in those relatively rural areas?
Yeah, so we give away all of our stories for free. So the small papers or big papers too can just grab the stories from our website and publish them right on their site or in their paper, as long as they give us credit. And that's something that we do as part of our mission. And our mission is to inform and engage Texans about Texas government and politics and policy. And there's been a decline, as I'm sure y'all know, of in newspapers and the number of journalists specifically covering the Capitol, but really just in newspapers in general around the state. And Community Impact has done a great job in filling some of that void. But there are places that used to have newspaper reporters and newspapers that used to have reporters at the Capitol that just no longer do. And so we just see that as our mission. And if we can cover these stories and give them to your local paper, so that the readers in those communities can be informed, then we're accomplishing our mission. And we do cover the whole state. So if there's something happening that that has to do with government and politics and policy, and it affects a small town or rural area of Texas, we want to cover that as well. We don't just want to cover the things in the cities.
That is perfect. We are coming right up on our time, but I want to give y'all an opportunity to say one last comment, if you wouldn't mind. We got a question through the Q&A. Just the literal practicality of what is the best way for a realtor to contact a reporter or a publication if they have an idea or a question, if it can be confusing about knowing who specifically to contact, if they just have a blank slate, how would you advise they take that first step? And Jenny, would you start that one?
Just contact the general mailbox, news@kvu.com. My name is so-and-so. I have this great idea. Who should I talk to? That's it, plain and simple. Do not make it the full page. We get hundreds of emails. I'm not even lying. So the shorter the email, put in your name, your contact, that's all we need. And so, and your idea. It's great. And that's it.
Amy or Lori, do you think there's anything to add to that? Or would you just say, even if you're starting from scratch, contact the newsroom and we can go from there?
Yeah, email is great. For us, it's tips@texastribune.org, or you can contact me directly, and we'll get it on to the right person. But yeah, email is a good way.
Yeah, ours is press@communityimpact.com. And then I would also add, make sure the subject line is very clear. For us, we're hyper local, so we just need to know like which area. Is it in Round Rock? Is it in Georgetown? Is it in Sugar Land? We just need to know where to direct that email, and that helps us out. And that'll help get you a response a lot quicker if we know who to connect you with.
Well, I want to thank you again for joining us here today. You've taken tons of notes, some great takeaways, very practical information for our Realtor members. We'll say goodbye now to Amy, Corey, and Jenny. And for the attendees, there's a lunch break. Your next session will kick off at 1 p.m. If you registered for the Governmental Affairs sessions, you'll attend today's episode, Local and State Issues, tie in a lot of the stuff we talked about here today. And if you register for the TREPAC session at 1 p.m., you'll attend Money Matters to learn about some fundraising tips. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoy the day.